Well, we're still in the book of John, and we're in chapter 18 still for the last time in chapter 18. And I will tell you the lesson this morning I think is really important. I just don't think it's as easy to follow or as interesting as some of the lessons that we might do, but it's really, really important. Can you remember that Jesus and Pilate are in discussion? And can you remember that I have said that it seems to me that Pilate is being kind to Jesus at this point? It's not rude. It's not a callous conversation, because Pilate knows well that these Jewish leaders have delivered Jesus unto him, and they've delivered him with no exact charge. They just say, we want him dead. And as he talks with Jesus, he knows that Jesus has done nothing. And he knows probably that all that trial by the Jews was done illegally, probably, and done poorly, and Jesus had no representation. And so Pilate understands all this. But in this little tiny passage of Scripture at the end of John chapter 18, Pilate asked a question. It would be so easy to breeze past the question, but I think we ought to think about it for a moment. So I want you to read with me, beginning in verse 37 to the end of the chapter. There's a few verses of John chapter 18. Let's look at the words. "You are a king then," said Pilate. Now remember from last week, they've been talking about the kingdom of Jesus. And Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came to this earth is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis of charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. Now there's a lot there. We'll pick up a little bit of it next week as we move into chapter 19. But I'm interested in the question. Did all of you see the question? The obvious question? Pilate responds to Jesus when Jesus says, "I was born into this world to tell you the truth." And Pilate responds and says, "Well, what is truth?" And do you suspect, or am I just imagining? Do you suspect that maybe Pilate is saying that with a bit of disgust in his body, his mind, his thought? Do you think he's saying that with this bewilderment? Because Pilate would know how hard it is to find the truth. Pilate is a Roman governor. And by the way of this trial taking place, we know that it's probably happening often that he is serving as a judge deciding a matter. Now, some of you have been on a jury. Have you? And so you listen, sometimes a short period of time, and sometimes it's a long period of time, and you listen to this side talk, and then you listen to the other side talk, and they have different opinions about what is right. And it appears that maybe sometime someone is not telling the truth. And so you go into the room assigned for the jury, and you're sitting there and you're talking among the other jurors, and you're trying to decide what is the right thing about this case. What is the truth about this case? And it's not always easy. And some of these trials are done with just a judge. no jury. And so Charles, the judge, listens to one side, listens to the other side. And they're different stories, and they're different positions. And maybe it appears that someone is not telling it exactly like it is. And they all have their own version. And you're constantly trying to find the truth. What is the truth? And we know this morning that we live in a world dominated by Satan. Now, do you remember back in John chapter 8, this same book in John chapter 8, what Jesus said about Satan? He is the father of what? All lies. He himself is a liar. He's a father of lies. He is a deceiver. And he wants to use everything he can to deceive us, because if we get deceived, we'll likely go down the wrong pathway. And so, if I tell you that our government doesn't always tell you the truth, do you agree to that? And sometimes they don't tell you the truth on purpose. And sometimes they don't tell you the truth and they don't know they're not telling you the truth. Now, everybody catch that? Because sometimes people mislead you and they don't even know they're misleading you. And so we go through all this pandemic. And I know that I'm going to get in big trouble for even mentioning it on the airwaves. We go through all this pandemic. And they haven't had a pandemic in our lifetime. And so they're rushing to figure out ways to solve. And they say, clean your hands. And they say, stay 6 feet away. And they say, wear a mask. And they say, these drugs work and these drugs don't work. And now we're after the fact and research is being done and they're saying, you know what, some of that stuff wasn't right. And some of that stuff may have been harmful. Where's the truth in all this? And we may never know. And we now know that big companies, big tech companies, and pharmaceutical companies, they don't tell us the truth. And sometimes I think maybe they don't tell us the truth because they don't know the truth. And sometimes they don't tell us the truth because they do know they're telling us a lie. I remember several years ago going to my medical doctor in Lubbock, Texas. He had been my medical doctor for years and years and years, was for over 20 years, until he retired at a very young age. He did the blood work. He came back and he said, your cholesterol is a little high. Now, my cholesterol now with taking nothing is really low. But your cholesterol is a little high. And with great enthusiasm, he said, I want you to take this one cholesterol drug or statin drug. And with even more enthusiasm, he said, if I had my way, I would put this, these are literally his quote, I would put this drug in our drinking water. I would have everybody taking this drug. Well, I took his statin drug for maybe 3 weeks or a month, not very long. But just a few months later, they recalled the drug. So many people were having so many problems with it that the pharmaceutical company was forced to recall it. My doctor didn't know, but with great enthusiasm, he was telling me something that was not right. And had I taken it for a long period of time, I might have gotten in a place I didn't want to be, because that's what always happens when you follow an untruth. And people don't tell us the truth sometimes. Everybody understand what I'm saying? Susan and I, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I don't remember the exact, middle of January, right after our service here, we, as quickly as we possibly could, got in the cars, had to take 2, and we went back to Oklahoma City, to Edmond. Because on campus, on that Sunday afternoon, they were having a memorial service. Now, in the big auditorium, we had a lot of people in the big auditorium, and we were remembering every person who had died that year, who had ever attended school at Oklahoma Christian University, and every faculty and staff who had died in that year. But after that memorial service, we went into a smaller auditorium, and it was pretty full of students and a few faculty and staff, and 2 families were there. And we were remembering a daughter from each of those 2 families who had died. Both girls were together at the time. One was a student, a senior at Oklahoma Christian, one was not. They were driving their car in a rainstorm. I don't know if it was a state park. All I know, it was around a huge lake. They think they were following the Maps application on their phone. Now, I don't know how they know that, unless they could know that from searching some kind of phone records from the cloud. But you know how those navigation systems in your phone work, don't you? Everybody knows that? And sometimes it says 300 feet, turn here, and I don't see a place in 300 feet, and I miss it, and they have taken me to the wrong place once in a while. I end in a place that this just can't be it. They're driving, and it says turn right here on this paved road. And they turn on the paved road. Only it wasn't a road. It was a boat ramp. And they drove into the lake, plunged into the lake in the massive rainstorm, and both girls lost their lives. And they think because they were given wrong information. Does everybody understand how important truth is? And how in our world truth is so hard to find? And people everywhere, sometimes intentionally and sometimes without even knowing, deceive. It's rampant. It's rampant. But in the midst of all of this, you and I know one thing. We know what real truth is, the one source of real truth. Because it was back in chapter 14 of the book of John, Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth, and I am life. No one can come to the Father except by me. Now I want you to hold that thought for just a second. And let's do some mathematical type logic. It's the kind of logic that Darren would teach in geometry. So if Jesus equals truth, and if Jesus equals God, which he said in John chapter 17, I and the Father are exactly the same, we're one. If Jesus equals truth, and if Jesus equals God, then the conclusion is God has to equal truth. Everybody follow that? And if God is truth, and if this book is God-breathed or God-given, if the Bible is the Word of God, truly the Word of God, and if God is true, then this book has to be, the conclusion is what? Truth. So in this world in which we live, where truth is so hard to find, and I understand what Pilate is saying when Pilate says, well, what is truth? How do I know what truth is? I understand that frustration. I deal with it myself over and over and over again with this dilemma and this dilemma. Weekly, dilemmas come, and I'm saying, what is the truth here? So I have 2 recommendations for you this morning. And the first is that you have to always, if not daily, ask God to show you what the truth is. I can tell you something. Even when I'm reading something I have read many, many times, I have a tendency to say, please show me what I need to see here. Show me the truth. And you know what I find? So very often I find that I have held this one view of this passage for so long, and now I read it, and I'm searching desperately for the truth, and all of a sudden it looks differently to me. And then I take that a step farther and I say, no matter what I'm doing, not only reading this, but no matter what I'm doing, I have now made it a habit to ask God over and over again in a single day, show me what I need to know right now and tell me what I need to say. Because I just mentioned all those dilemmas I face. You face them too. You face dilemmas all the time. What should I do? Because everything is not black and white. Everybody got that? It's not black and white. And wisdom is that space between black and white where you're trying to figure out what you should do. And I'm not that smart, and I'm not that wise, and so you ask God over and over again, show me. Tell me what I need to know. What do I need to say? Because you search for truth all the time. Because you and I know from what we just said that if we don't have the truth, we may end up in a spot we don't want to be. Something really, really bad might happen to us. We might end up in a really difficult situation with our lives. So I have one more thought about truth. It's one of my favorite thoughts about truth ever. When you have found the truth, when you know the truth, you share it. But you share it, look at the slide, with grace and with kindness. Because it's the only way truth ever really gets heard. I've tried sharing it with my children without kindness. Loudly, harshly, and sometimes meanly. After just a little while, guess what? They don't pay any attention to me whatsoever. And now at this stage in life, I go to restaurants and I go to grocery stores or I go wherever, and sometimes I'll see people dealing with their little children. And they're being so loud and they're being so harsh, and maybe the child needs to be told. But they're being, and I want to say to them, you're destroying your child. Your child is not going to listen to a word you say. And the older they get, the less they'll listen. It has to be done with kindness. It has to be done with grace. And maybe I have the truth right here. Maybe I think I've got the truth figured out. And I'm going to tell all of you the new truth I've found. If you preach with hardness and you preach with callousness, if you tell people, are you going to listen to me? You're probably not going to come back because that has no place. And so 2 times in John's gospel, in chapter 4, chapter 8, Jesus shows us how this works. Because both times, interestingly enough, he's dealing with a woman. Both times, these particular woman, each woman, has gotten her life in a mess. Both times. One of them is outside the city drawing water at noontime, if you remember. Little town of Sychar, Samaritan city. And Jesus is there by the well. The disciples have gone into the city, and she is there getting water, and Jesus and the woman talk about a drink. The conversation goes on to living water. The woman says, I'd like to have some living water. Where do I get it? And Jesus said, now Jesus knows everything, okay? He said, if you go get your husband, I'll tell you the secret to this. And she said, I have no husband. And can you just see how Jesus does this? How he tenderly smiles and says, I know you've had 5 husbands. And you're living right now with a man to whom you're not married. And she changes the subject, and they go ahead and have a conversation. And Jesus goes right along with her. She changes the subject. He goes right along, and he talks through that subject. And the end of the story, you know what she's doing? She leaves her water jars, and she races back into the city, and she says, I have found the man who's told me everything about me, and he, I know, is the Messiah. He is the one that God promised, because, see, these Samaritans are half Jews. They knew the Jewish story. And had Jesus barked out and been mean and harsh and said, you ought to know better to live like this. Well, how could you dare do this? She would not have run back into the city like that. And that one in John chapter 8, these same people who are now demanding Jesus be crucified, they brought her trying to trick Jesus, and they threw her down in front of Jesus and said, we caught her with another guy. And we ought to stone her. That's what Moses says. Well, Jesus knows she's been in the wrong. He knows she's messed up. And Jesus says, well, why don't you do that? But why don't the one of you who has the least sin throw the stone, or has no sin throw the stone first? And they all leave. Now here, watch what Jesus does next. He said, no one's going to accuse you, ma'am. No one's going to accuse you. You can leave. But I want you to go, and I want you to quit the sinning, okay? Don't you wish we knew the end of some of those stories? Don't you wish Paul Harvey, some of you don't know who Paul Harvey is, was around to tell us the end of some of those stories? I wonder if the woman ever got in a mess again. Because the truth teller was so kind to her. Okay, you got time for one more really quick one? My favorite of all. It's not quite time to end. It's in the life of David. It's my favorite all-time David story. It's not David and Goliath. I mean, there are other David stories, but this is a time when David is out in the wilderness running from Saul. He has these 600 fighting men and their families, and they're in the desert, and he's trying to feed them. Big job, trying to feed them. And there is a rich man in that area, really rich man. And he's been shearing his sheep. It's harvest time. But now he's rich, but he's also just a mean character. He's mean in disposition. He's stubborn. He's calloused. He's harsh. I guess he's one of these guys who probably yells all the time. But David knows it's harvest time. It's shearing time. And David sends 10 young soldiers to him and says, our master David said to come, and it wants to remind you that all the time your herdsmen were out in this wilderness, David never took anything from you. In fact, he protected them. And this old mean rich guy said, who is this David, the son of Jesse? He's probably some runaway slave. I'll give him nothing. And you see those 10 young men just turn around and almost their heads down or shoulders slumped, and they go back and say, David, he's not going to give you anything. And here's what he said about you. Anybody remember how David responds? It's classic. David said, he's done for. He straps on his sword. He says, 400 men, get on your swords. And may the Lord deal with me, and may it be ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow, Nabal and every male in his entire ownership is not dead. I'm going to kill every servant male. I'm going to kill every sheep male. I'm going to kill every male is gone. And he's on his way. And I'm telling you, David means business. And David is one good fighter. But Nabal is married to a woman who is kind and tender and beautiful. It had to be an arranged marriage. Okay? That's what people say to Susan all the time. Did someone arrange? You would never marry him, would you? It had to be an arranged marriage. But it wasn't her folks, because her folks wouldn't have done it either, you know. They wouldn't have teamed her up with someone like me. But she hears about it. And she loads up some donkeys with food, and she goes out to meet David. And when she meets David, she falls right down on the ground before him, right here. And she says, "My Lord and my Master." And she has a lot to say, but she says this: "You're going to be king. God's working in your life. You're going to be king over everything. And would you like to come to this kingdom with innocent blood on your hands? You're about to kill a lot of innocent people here because of that husband of mine who is a fool." And David just stops. She is so kind. She tells him the truth in such a gentle way. He just stops and says, in essence, "Thank you. Thank you for stopping me from doing this. Thank you for telling me the truth." And he goes back home. Now, 10 days later, I will tell you, that big, mean, ugly disposition man, he has what I would call a heart attack. Heart turned to stone. His wife's free. David's pretty smart, too. He goes and marries her. Okay? I'm not going to let that one get away. Do you see my point? If you find the truth, deliver it with such kindness and with such grace so that people can hear it. And those of you who are school teachers, I know you get so frustrated. You want to twist their heads off. Is that right, Greg? Greg would be that way. No, he wouldn't. But you don't know what they've been through, so you just try to deal with them differently. And they'll remember it for the rest of their lives. They'll remember the person who treated them differently for the rest of their lives. Even who told them the truth differently. Does that make all sense to you? What is truth? You're not going to find it likely from our government. You're going to find it from politicians. You're not going to find it from big companies. They have their own agendas. It starts right here. It starts right here. If you don't have the truth, you end up in the lake, somewhere like it. You get the truth, you end up in the right spot. So let's stop and take the Lord's Supper. I will tell you that everything that we've been talking about, Jesus is going through when he didn't have to. He's having a conversation with Pilate. He knows Pilate's going out there to talk to them saying, "Let's release him." He knows already they're not going to release me. But he stayed the course that we could be healed of all of our wrongs. Just forgiven. Isn't that wonderful news?